Good morning and welcome to this Informatica and Agile Solutions webinar entitled Digital Transformation, a Data Management Culture. This is the third in a series that we've been running throughout this year. The fourth one will be coming in October, which we'll give you more details a little bit about later. But we've been exploring this idea of how organizations are needing to think about how the culture around the management of data really helps organizations move their way forward. And really today, I just wanted to start off with a couple of key ideas which are really kind of core to all of this. And why are organizations actively thinking about this idea of a data management culture? Well, I think actually it's probably some fairly simple things. The first one is really around this idea that in the new economy and in the new world that we're facing, this idea that we need to transform. I think we all recognize that many organizations are going through transformation, particularly digital transformation. But it's also about helping us survive change, help survive disruption or be disruptive. And of course, in the future, we want it to help us thrive and take advantage of the situation that we're in. So my name is Andy Joss. I'm head of data governance for Informatica here across Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. I'm joined by Mel this morning. Mel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Andy. Yes, so I'm Melanie Parker, and I'm a principal consultant for Agile Solutions, heading up their data strategy and data governance practice there.
Fantastic, thank you. So let's just do a little bit of a recap on some of the things that we've been talking about, just to really give us a bit of context today about what we're talking around, which is around the topic of process. This idea of a roadmap for digital transformation. The way that we've been looking at this is really to say, if you kind of think of this in three core parts. The first is really around having the right kind of business model. And that's really the why we're doing and what we're doing. What is obviously going to be driven then by the data strategy from a data particular viewpoint. And then we need to think about how we're going to deliver all of this and put all this together, which is really around the data organization. So this becomes significant because we're going to have a look at some of this a little bit later and maybe look at how we can think of doing some of these things differently in a world where data is driving the business process. I'll come back to that in a minute. Some of the things that we're seeing as organizations, I think, is that some of the outcomes that organizations are either achieving or looking for on their digital transformation journey. It can be everything moving away from paper to electronic services, all the way through to maybe fundamentally changing the relationship and the experience that organizations have with their customers and their suppliers. So the digital transformation is a common topic. Most organizations are going through it in some way, shape or form and have some desired outcomes that are coming from it. But actually, if you kind of look at this in a slightly more generic viewpoint, and maybe one of the common ways of looking at this is thinking about how organizations are seeing digital transformation as helping them adapt to be more focused and targeted on meeting the needs of customers, not just today, but of course customers in the future. And also thinking about how this helps them become more operational efficient. So it's a common set of outcomes. And a common theme that we've been talking about throughout this webinar and roundtable series is this idea that in the world of the new economy and the new type of business models that organizations are actively looking at and will probably be driving quite significantly over the next 3 to 5 years, is this idea of that where we've been has really been focused around where the process has driven the data. But actually, we think there's a fundamental change happening right now, and that's where data drives the process. And today we're going to be exploring this notion of process and how all of these things fit together in a wee bit more detail. Coming back to this idea of data management culture, or actually lots of organizations already spend time managing data. So if organizations have a data culture, and typically that would be about the capture and maybe use of data, are they in a good shape for digital transformation and some of the outcomes that we've been talking about? Actually, I think we'd probably argue that this idea of what's missing in reality, though, is this a data management culture. And it's not just then about the capture of data, but what we do with it. Why do organizations actually need this concept of a data management culture? Well, it's like any asset. If data is an asset, it doesn't look after itself. And actually, it doesn't magically do whatever people need it to do without some kind of maintenance and some kind of care. And this is about instilling these ideas of data management culture, helping organizations not just capture data, but actually manage data effectively, and then how they can use that data to transform what they do. So it's a bit about a change in data emphasis. What could that look like? Well, today, many organizations, if I think about this idea of they have a data culture, Well, they understand a functional need for data. And yes, actually, they're probably quite good at collecting data. They probably fix and use data probably within limited organizational scopes. And we know if it doesn't exist, well, we probably know how to create that. And we also know that these things look like they're right. But actually, I think in the new economy and this new way of thinking where data is driving process, this idea that a data management culture gets us thinking about things in a subtly but I think quite significant way. So we're moving from this idea, for example, of understanding the functional need of data to understanding the organizational need of data. So you can see here the scope has changed, got a bit bigger. We've been proficient at collecting data in a data management culture world. Is collecting the data from the right place at the right time and in the right way. And it's about having a little bit more certainty and trust in the data and the analytics that we've got, to moving away from this looks like the right data in the old world to this is the right data, that degree of certainty, that degree of trust that we get. And data management cultures really help support all of those kind of concepts. One of the things that we've also been talking about is kind of what we call the categories of a data management culture. This, as we say, is the third in a series of 4. We've already explored data strategy and collaboration as kind of the start point for this. We've already explored the role of the governance of data, and today we're going to explore the process side of things in a wee bit more detail. And really just kind of wrapping all of this up, what does a data management culture kind of look like? Well, we just tried to put together a sense of these are some of the attributes that we think would make up a data management culture, an organization that's driving the right kind of cultural use and therefore benefits from data. By putting all of these things together, we really think it materially helps organizations achieve the type of outcomes that ultimately they're trying to get from their digital transformations. So let's just kind of think a little bit more about process, and let's just explore kind of where a lot of organizations have been, or maybe where organizations are. And this, we kind of call this the traditional approach to process. And I guess the start point for all this really is, well, what do we mean by the word process? Well, actually, you can argue there's lots of different types of processes. We've got business processes, operational processes, and then when we come down the stack, we've got operational data processes, technical data processes. You can imagine there's probably quite a raft of these. And organizations will have different types of processes, serving different needs, serving the business in different ways, and trying to build a range of outcomes. Okay, so that's kind of what we mean. But how are processes described? Well, we have everything from maybe something that's written down on a piece of paper, or it might be in someone's head. So here's an example of this is what somebody might instinctively do if they want to go and read that email, for example. If somebody explained that to you, you could probably execute that process quite effectively just with those 4 lines, or somebody told you to do 5 lines, and those are 5 things you were told to do. There's other ways of looking at process, which is we might want to be a lot more specific and a lot more quantified. So here, as you can see, there's a little noddy flowchart of the same thing. And now we're starting to be a lot more thorough, but also a lot more prescriptive in the type of questions that we need to ask to ensure that we follow the process in the right way, and that the outcomes that we're looking for are going to be derived in the right way too. Now, there's lots of different ways of looking at process, and this isn't the only 2 ways of looking at it, but it's really just to give you a sense of, we can think of these things as being sort of quite ad hoc, or maybe sitting in people's heads, all the way through to very formalized and very detailed and prescriptive. And then thinking about how processes are typically implemented in an organization, we have everything from manual processes. So I particularly liked an icon of somebody changing a baby's nappy. I still haven't worked out how you can automate that process, but someday I'm sure we will. But the idea was that we've got very manual processes, and this is obviously a process which is done on demand. We won't talk about that anymore. I think we can probably guess what the on demand means. We've also got teams and groups of people working together, collaborating around tasks. And of course, we've also then got fully automated, systemized processes that automatically do lots of great and cool stuff, and lots of different things that sit in between too. So processes are pretty much everywhere, right? And then thinking about this idea of where many organizations are today, with this idea that process drives the data. Well, then some of the questions that we'd be quite rightly asking is, okay, so why are we doing this? What are we doing? How do we do it? When it's very prescriptive in its nature. And what it's tending us to drive activity-wise is us to think of things in a very linear fashion. By linear, I don't necessarily mean to say we're only going in one direction, but we have a series of activities and tasks, and we're kind of just following the process. And this idea of changing the world and data driving the process, actually, rather than just following the process, maybe we just need to think of this differently. Let's just follow the data. Maybe there's a bit of a mindset change that needs to come with this too.
So Andy, so that's really interesting. We talk about the data driving the process, but does that really work for the ad hoc process environment as well?
I think it could, and I think we need to get to a state where I think organizations need to have enough trust in the data they've got. So trust, I think, is going to come from a number of places. I think one of those would be, do we have all the data we need to make all the right decisions? And it's not just about data, of course, because if we have all the data, we're going to have to do something with that. So that's probably an analytics conversation as well. So having the right data, having the right analytical capabilities, and then understanding what kind of business model and business strategy we got. This says, actually, if we have the right data and the right analytical capabilities, is it driving the outcomes that we're looking for? And then thinking about how the role of the actual process itself plays in all of this, to me then says, if I have an ad hoc process, then as long as I have the right understanding of the strategy, of what, as in what I'm trying to do and why I'm trying to do it, and I have the right data and the right technology and that analytics, which is the how I'm going to do it, I can combine those together and help drive any process, whether it be ad hoc or not.
Thank you.
Hopefully that made sense. Yeah, it seems to make sense to me anyway. And just kind of digging into this idea of process driving data, whatever type of process it is, then some of the strategic considerations that we kind of lean towards are, thinking about the process design, how good or perfect or close to reality that is, thinking about how the combination of the strategy to the process and the process to the strategy, so how we're supporting the needs of the strategy from a process viewpoint, how we measure things, because if we can't measure it, then we can't improve it and maintain it, and of course, who owns what, the ownership model. So they're very good topics to have in their own right. I think the thing that I see organizations looking at is saying these are very fixed things that we're doing, and we've been driven down particular routes by the direction that the process takes. In this new world of data-driving process, we still need to think of some of these things, but I think the context in which we think of them and what drives our activity, I think, are things that are going to change over time. And then when you think about how processes physically get instantiated, then sometimes they're completely manual processes, sometimes they're completely automated processes, and sometimes they kind of sit in the middle. I would argue for most organizations probably have all of these in abundance. Whether they be formalized processes or informal ones kind of doesn't really matter. But of course, the problem that we get with all of this is that actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to make something happen, drive an outcome, but we're inducing lots of problems along the way. Simple things like process gaps and process breakdowns. How often do we spend time trying to fix a problem? And what's the cause of the problem? Well, we followed a process and then it stops, so we're kind of backtracking, thinking about how things get duplicated or the kind of human intervention comes into this. And then, particularly in the world of ad hoc processes, how do we trace what actually happened and what decisions we made? So there are lots of challenges that come with this approach, and many people in many industries spend huge amounts of time trying to put technologies and capabilities in place to try and remediate some of these issues. But actually, fundamentally, just following the process isn't necessarily going to stop these things from happening. And I guess then the idea that when you think about what we call the process layers, these different types of layers in the organization, today most organizations tend to think of processes as things that they have in their control. So what we call internal control. It's things that we can put our arms around and say, this is our process, this is how we make it work. We understand inputs and outputs and how to make these things work in our environment. I think in the new economies, we're going to have to start to think differently. So will we have some internal process? Probably. Will a lot more of it become external in this kind of new ecosystem of partnerships? Absolutely. And I think that's part of what we're going to have to think about is what's going to drive that new world where we have this range of partnerships and maybe specialist providers. Actually, it's not necessarily going to be the process. It's the data that's going to drive who we're going to work with, how we're going to work with them, when we're going to work with them, and physically what we're going to do with them. And then thinking about this idea of why organizations have followed this notion of process driving data. Well, for many organizations, it's been about reg compliance or a privacy agenda. There's a process for doing M&A, customer demand, whether it be around cost or service delivery. There's lots of reasons why we've done this. And it's not to say that they're not bad reasons because we've gotten to a good state with it. But actually thinking about the drivers of things like the business strategy, the complexity we've got, I would argue that in 2019 and moving over the next 5 to 10 years, business strategies have and are changing, and in some cases quite fundamentally. Complexity has probably gone up. We now have plethoras of organizations that make and sell products in the same market. Cost is always a challenge. There's always going to be competitive pressures. Time to market, do we want to be me too or me first? And then thinking about the business model and the business case, I think these pressures on the drivers, have increased and will only increase. So I think the model has worked well for now, but I think now the model needs to change. And this is where the idea of data-driving process starts to come into place. And one of the ideas I just wanted to share with you here is just thinking about how the business strategy connects down to data. So at the top level, you can argue then you've got the strategy for the business and then the model that supports that. You then have operations, processes, and at the bottom of the stack, you have data. I would argue in the new world, we possibly need to think about inverting this model and putting data at the top and saying, actually, rather than looking at top down, then actually we maybe have a degree of bottom up, or flip it around, in which case top down starts with data, then process, then operation. So I think in this new world, it's about rethinking the way that we've done things, and this idea of the way we've always done things, it got us to this point. I think we need to think fundamentally about how we do things differently in the future, because that's how we're going to take advantage of all the opportunities which are coming up. So it's this new approach to process, and really, I guess the fundamental thing is, well, what's changing? Because we talked a lot about business process and optimization for a long period of time. Well, actually, the really good news, or the bad news, depending on your viewpoint, is actually a lot of things are potentially going to change. I don't think we need to worry about the fact that there's lots of things here, and this is probably not a complete list. I think the really important thing being is to recognize, like all organizations, when we do these things, it's a journey. So if we're on a journey, then we will pick some of these things to do, as a priority over others. There are some things which will be more important now or more important in 5 years' time. There are some things which will be easier or harder, but it's about having a plan that matches up with the strategy that says these are the types of things we're going to have to think about. So something as simple as digital twins. Right, so I put that one first for a very, very good reason. So in a physical world, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we do things physically. In this new world, having a digital twin for everything then says to me, even if I've got new data products, new information products, where I had no physical anything other than the physical connection into the wall from my computer, then actually a digital twin really gives me an opportunity to understand what it is I'm doing, how I'm doing things, and how to improve and take advantage of market opportunity. And we're going to cope with some other challenges such as shorter degrees of latency, how fast things are going to happen, because obviously in this new world, we give ourselves the opportunity of removing the physical constraints. So that leads to lots more challenges, but also therefore lots more potential capabilities. And at the very end, we've got more automation. And a lot of what's happened in the world of process has been about automating processes, and it's gotten us to a great point. I think automation, but it's automation in a different way. And what I mean by that is thinking about how we automate the management of data and how we have the culture around data, the data management culture we talked about, more automation around our analytics, and more automation about how we use this information to drive our business forward. So yeah, there's lots of going on, lots of potential changes, but actually it's about having a journey that helps you start to get going on that front to help drive the strategy and the outcomes you're looking for. A couple of good things, though, actually, is there are some things that absolutely stay the same. So the reasons why we're doing these things, I think, still stay the same. Yeah, we are businesses, we're here to make money or provide service, whatever our rationale happens to be. In the new world, this is just maybe a new way of thinking about how we go about doing some of those things and a more effective way of doing those things. We'll still have stakeholders. Those stakeholders will be internal, but also increasingly probably more external as well. So it's about how we manage that stakeholder relationship. Most organizations probably do that today, but we'll probably have more of that to come. And of course, we have the process types. Well, those probably aren't really going to change. We're still going to have manual and semi-automated and automated processes. We probably still have that forever, I would guess. But actually, ultimately, it's how you tie all this stuff together to help drive the outcomes that you're looking for, I think becomes a really important step.
So Andy, just before you
sure.
A quick question for
you.
We're just talking about dynamic processes.
Okay, yeah.
So haven't we heard about that terminology before? What's changed?
No, it's a really good question. So we're actually going to talk a little bit about dynamic processes in a minute, but I think it's a really, really important point. And lots of organizations have said, well, in terms of the way that they think about process, this idea of a dynamic process really, to me, talks about how are we going to think about the different ways that we're going to do things. So today, you think about process, and that example I have about doing email, you follow step one, you do step two, and then you make a decision. It's kind of very finitely driven. I think in this new world of a dynamic process, I think it's a combination of things. So I think it's a combination of processes where I need to have a formalized process. So if you're in a regulated industry, for example, you may need to have some formalized process from a regulatory viewpoint. But actually then you could also add to that other types of capabilities, which is more better data. And you could add to that insights which are driven by analytics or AI, machine learning, whatever it happens to be. I think it's that combination, when you put it together, that then says each step of a process, rather than just being a step of a process, it is a combination of things. And as you put that combination together, the data and the analytics is helping me understand, where do I go next? What do I do next in the process? So it's maybe a bit of a complex model for people to get their head around, but fundamentally it's how data is driving where we're going, because we then trust the data, and that comes from both data and from analytics. But great question, thank you. Just thinking about this new world then that we have, with whether it be dynamic processes or not, this is kind of the model that we had earlier. Again, kind of what's changed? Well, I would argue then that we now need to think very seriously about digital operations, not just physical. Now, I know some organizations will be doing this, but I think this has to be done at an enterprise level, on an enterprise scale, for everything an organization does. It might sound like a big task, but actually we do most of it today already, not necessarily just formalized. And we need to think also a lot more about the digital version of processes and the digital process as well. Probably the biggest thing for me that's going to change in reality is the arrow. So here on the way it was today, process really drives data. I think in the new world, there's going to be a lot more interaction between data and process. So at some point, maybe process will be driving the data, but there are other times where data is driving the process. And then that combination of what's the right thing to do at any one point in time, I think that's where we need to start thinking about a model that says, okay, so if data is now driving the process, that's telling me where I go next.
So Andy, would you coin that as being the new data-driven organization, when we actually think about how that data-driven process is enacted?
I think that's a really good example of what a data-driven organization would be doing.
Okay.
And it's not just about collecting data. I think it's about how you use data to change what you do, to drive your business strategy, the outcomes you're looking for. But I think it's also inherently for organizations to think about how they use data, to think about, well, today's model may work today, but is it going to work tomorrow? And if it's not, what model will work? And I think that idea of data then driving things and finding the right mix and balance, because obviously there are times when you're going to have to think, well, some things I can do, maybe some things I can't. Regulatory reasons might be one of those. Then I think that's the new world that we're absolutely living in. So yeah, thank you. Good question. And then thinking about lots of organizations, we're now at much more data and information type of products. So we're seeing a lot more demand of not just for physical products, but we're also seeing a lot of other products that come with that, and some obvious ones. Just I bought a new car recently, and one of the services that they offer on top of that is to collect data from lots of other cars, and then they kind of offer it back to me as a service. And it might be traffic problems, weather problems, whether it happens to be. So that's taking a physical product and creating data products from it. Some organizations just have data products, so we'll have this kind of mix of things. But I think increasingly, this idea of the data and the information product, I think if it either enhances or adds value to an existing physical product, that's seen as a good value-added service, and in some cases that is the service, in which case that's what people are buying into. But actually, if we're going to make these truly effective and truly differentiating, as opposed to just another Me Too, then we have to think about, well, how do we make this relevant and timely, and what it is that the person who's buying the service is actually looking for. And I think it's data driving the process that will help us understand that, because then we know we're offering the right service in the right way and at the right time. And then your point about digital processes, Mel, I think is a really, really interesting one. And that's just to kind of get us thinking about moving away from maybe that relatively fixed and static view, which some organizations have, of just following the process. It tells me what I need to do. Whereas actually, I think it's a combination of things. That's a combination of yes, there are some things that we know we need to do, but actually then there's insights that help us understand, well, is that the right thing to do, or should we be doing something else, or should we be going somewhere else, or should the activity be different? And then we need the data to support both of those. And it's that combination together, I think, which will make the difference. So actually this then looks like it's a fixed path. In the green, in the old world, it was a fixed path. We went from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. In the new world, it might be the first step might take us to the second step, but we don't know. It might actually take us to the third step. And of course, then when we get to the outcome, which is what we're looking for, what's the best or the optimal way of doing that? Well, we may be moving away from that. What's the right way of doing that?
So Andy, would you say that this is more geared towards scalability and the ability for the flexibility of change as it goes forward? Because traditional business processes tend to be quite static, quite time-driven in the sense of the overall outcome, but in a data world, the time to market is a lot more critical, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So I think flexibility, I think for some organizations this will be key. I think timeliness, I think for some organizations this will be key. But for some organizations, this is just going to be about being operationally efficient. For some processes, we spend a lot of time looking at processes and trying to make them as efficient as possible. This is just a different way of thinking of doing things. And sometimes we don't need to do things, and maybe there's a better, more optimal way of doing things. So I actually think for organizations, adopting this approach will have different benefits, and again, it will support different drivers for their organization. The big question that I always get is when I talk to organizations about digital transformation, and I just say, so what does data-driven mean to those organizations? And very often it's a hard question for them to answer. But I think what this to me then says is organizations which are looking at this approach can say, actually data-driven says, today, I was following a step in a process. Tomorrow, the data is going to tell me where I need to go. I have to have trust in it, so I need to have lots of things to enable me to do that. But actually, ultimately, it's going to help me achieve the goals I've got better, faster, cheaper. And actually, I think at this point, Mel, I think you were just going to talk a little bit about kind of how these process approaches have changed.
Yep, exactly. So from my perspective and the types of things that I've seen within the client organisations is that we have gone from what we've stated before, that traditional top-down requirements-driven approach. It's very prescriptive, it's very much conceptual, then drill down into the detail. We've seen old methodologies before around business process management and also BPMN notation, that type of thing, to help articulate and illustrate what these things need to be. However, from this centric approach, what we're talking about here is the data availability that you were talking about will absolutely bring in a lot more disruption to those processes. And if they skip steps in their decision-making processes themselves, or if it's machine-to-machine, making that decision-making on behalf of the human interventional step, hence the data demand that's then going to drive from that. So some of the organisations we see is definitely got a hybrid approach at the moment, so they're still grappling with those old legacy, very much critical core business processes that are within the supply chain. However, they're now looking at analytics of how they can actually branch out of some of those really long, elastic kind of areas in their business functions they need to be. So it's interesting to see that change.
And I think just kind of looking at this idea of that centric approach, is it solely around innovation, do you think, or is this just actually about something that's going to help us survive and thrive in the future?
Well, I think traditionally it's always been the onus on the organisation to drive innovation from an inside-out approach, and I'll come on to that in a minute around what we mean by outside-in, because it won't just be the data that's driving it as its own entity, that will have a correlation against what it is that we're trying to populate. So whether that be customer demand, supplier demands, product demands, all the data and its entities around how it's constructed will start to drive the innovation and where things need to be flexible to move with the new competing business models or innovation and changes, surely because the organisation doesn't have now the time to respond to through the traditional mechanisms.
Okay, that's really good.
So really what I was talking about there is the customer centricity part of this. Now, it doesn't have to be customers, as I said, it could be product, supplier, it could be a multitude of things. But really, this diagram here is really trying to illustrate the fact that we have to have flexibility, innovation, but the three key components of this is your data supply chain, data literacy, and also your data management culture. So this is all about really understanding how data can augment your existing supply chains and third-party relationships that you touched on before. You've got data literacy, which is your cross-functional teams and interdependencies. So how do we actually upskill your departments, your internal employee skills, to start having these types of conversations? And really that is the first leg on the journey before we get to the full maturity curve within the data management culture, because that's where you're really going to start to see behaviours and disciplines, including governance, that's going to be able to help you have that critical thinking, the design disruption, which will drive your innovation and help you to explore new business ideas that, again, will attach back to your original business strategy. So they all are together. They're not one single solution to this. But definitely from that outside-in approach, you're suddenly therefore designing your organisational structures and your operational processes to serve the demands of, in this instance, the customer, rather than the fact that you are of a specific industry and therefore you've got processes that are industry-focused.
So that actually leads to a really important point, I think. So this outside-in idea, then if we're saying that outside in is about making sure that we kind of have the right capabilities to support our customers, haven't we always been doing that? Hasn't every business done that for the last millennia? Or so what's different? What's changed?
Well, I think what's different and what's changed is you've always had the customer and market insights sort of analytical functions being very much at the forefront, driving some of that engagement, but your back office operations have remained the same. But with this new model and the way that we're thinking is actually pushing the back office operational processes to the forefront to ensure that customer engagement at the very beginning, there is a right shift to the left, which says actually that we're going to reduce the time that it takes for that customer interaction or that product delivery, for example, and make that into the hands of the customer, as opposed to the timelines that are imposed by the organisation. So it's making them much more in charge of what it is and when it is that they expect to see things delivered.
Do you think that organisations are ready for that?
Not all. I think a lot of it, as you say, is on a journey. But if you take the likes of, in the customer kind of focus area, you look at companies such as Amazon, and they're absolutely breaking that model as we speak. So I can see a lot more shifting into that arena. And therefore, again, if it's product, supplier, etc., if they start to really think about how they can digitise their operational focus, just exactly how that's going to hinge on the back end of their operations as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that particular model. I mean, you think about a lot of online purchasing, which I guess many of us do quite frequently. Then actually a decision-making criteria for me as an individual is, some organisations, I can look at products online, and it's quite hard to find out, A, if there's any in stock, and B, when I'm actually going to get it. So I can see how, if you bring all that to the front, it helps me from a decision-making point. But actually, if you make it easy and seamless to understand, is it in stock, and can I have it today or tomorrow or whenever? Or if I can't, then actually materially, that's a really important thing for me. So I can see how that's maybe a very trivial example of kind of bringing that outside in thinking, because it helps kind of shapes the experience that the customer has.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
So in terms of how we should be able to start thinking about how we would set ourselves up to be able to deliver some of this stuff, it's all to do with service design. So if we were moving into that service delivery kind of world, but you've got to think about what does service delivery mean to the internal organisation. So the internal controls that we started off with today, this is around how do we get to a position of digital ubiquity. Now that is where we've got information products, physical products combining, you've got smart products, you've got augmented deliverables that comes off the back of that and outcomes that you can resell. You've got your functional design, so we have to think about, is the structures and the functional designs within the organisation still fit for purpose? Do they need to be more augmented, aligned, streamlined? And also, what are some of the trade-offs that we can make? Well, clearly, there'll always be core and critical processes to deliver, such as regulation, as you were saying, Andy. But there must be trade-offs between the duplication of some effort and processes within multiple departments. So how do we need to do that? So we look at that sort of user-centric, customer inside-out approach, or outside-in approach, should I say. Therefore, is that to do with human factors design, using the persona methodology from that instance, which we do today. Think about connected services. So this again isn't just about smart products externally, but connected services across your supply chain, which in turn will then make sure that you've got a data supply chain that supports that. We'll go into this a bit more detail in the roundtable events then, Andrew.
Yep.
It's to do with data management operations and what does that actually look like. You've also got data governance service delivery, which actually underpins all of this. So your lineage, your auditability, your data quality, to trust the information that you're looking for this type of analytical decision making. And it's all driven by self-service analytics and, of course, new technologies in the robotic space. You've got RPA and IoT, MTM, that type of thing that's starting to really start to come out of its fruition now.
Cool.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting diagram. I've taken this from Porter and Hippelman in 2015, but essentially it's just a snapshot of what we mean by, on a page, what kind of things can we see as fundamentally shifting within organizational change. So we're already seeing that IT and innovation through Agile and DevOps are looking to really speed up that innovative cycle. Going back to my earlier slide around customer centricity, you may have your marketing and service support teams amalgamating to make sure you've got customer success management, so you don't have this idea of pre-sales and post-sales. It's an ongoing engagement with the customer. But more importantly, the unified data organization at the top is more importantly where you would probably find your new chief data officer or chief data office organization. And this is really about how do we do all of the data management core operations at an enterprise level that you were talking about, and how do we get the architecture to support it. So I just think I'll leave that there because I think that's where we'll deep dive in at the roundtable event, just around how we can explore that.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's the fact that it's been around for 4 years already. Just kind of says it's not like this is brand new rocket science. But actually, for me, like the unified data organization, the role of the chief data officer. I don't know about you, I'm seeing more, but actually, there still I don't think are enough chief data officers, and particularly here you can see it's at a very senior level. Many of the ones I've met don't actually work out that level. So thinking about the reality of this,
and the remit as well, and
absolutely
controls, etc.
Well, one question I did want to ask you about this, Mel, is that if you kind of think about a typical organisation that has these functions, then very often these are individual business units. It might be done on a global scale, so they might be distributed.
Absolutely.
And the way they're measured and the KPIs they had are quite specific. So manufacturing set of measures and KPIs is going to be very different from sales, potentially. So therefore, are they necessarily completely aligned? Well, maybe not, because obviously their measures are slightly different. So how does that work then in a big, complex, multinational organization?
So for me, it's sort of that sort of onion layered approach, if you like. So for me, you're always going to have the core and critical processes that, as you say, will need their own KPIs, product, time to market, etc., quality assurance, etc. But actually, if you combine that data with the analytics and say, actually, if we were to combine that with the customer demand, that really then starts to drive the data strategy around what is it that you're trying to support, and actually how much speed and adaptability are you trying to embed in that into that process. So what does good look like? If you can't measure that, really it's your customer that's going to drive what good looks like, as opposed to any business analysis function within that organization. So it's really just trying to figure out what is the temperature check around what needs to happen versus what's nice to happen, if you like. So how do you measure that in twofold parts? So outside KPIs versus your internal KPIs.
Okay, cool. And I guess we can explore that more in the roundtable. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I'm just conscious that we're running short of time. So I just want to kind of bring things to a little bit of a close and summarise kind of what we've got to. So really, one of the things that we talked about a lot in this series is this idea of, for many organisations, this notion of that process drives data is actually now becoming, but the fact that data is now driving the process. And today we wanted to start to explore, well, kind of what does that mean? What sort of change does that start to bring about? What are the things we're going to have to think about? And some of it's actually relatively straightforward. Some of it's quite fundamental, I think, in terms of kind of the role of data in the business strategy. And then thinking about how this then is helped and supported by that data management culture, I think then says, if we can start to think about, if this is what we do need to be doing, then actually making this work across an organization means that we have to start thinking seriously about data and about the management of data, hence the data management culture, because it's one of the three core parts that we need, which is the activity of the process, it's the analytics, and it's data. So I think data management culture is a really important topic for all this, and the way that process is changing, I think, is a key part of that. We've actually Mel, we've just got time for a couple of quick questions before the end. So, quick question for you. First one up we've got is, can this really work where we have systems like SAP or other ERP systems, maybe CRMs, where the processes are all predefined?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting point of view, because clearly there are lots of legacy platforms out there and standalone systems that organisations have spent years trying to implement, and they've already got them into predefined working order, if you like. But for me, data management, data governance, data operations, all these types of things, that for me are another layer that sits across those. So we're not talking about replacing those.
Yeah.
We're talking about making sure that we're getting the right value out of that layer into the data management and analytics space, so that we can actually capitalise on it, leverage it against the data that's coming from other areas of the business. And it's all about the question that you ask of the data, as opposed to what the system's actually capable of delivering. So you've got to always have that critical thought about what is it you're trying to achieve, or what's the actual outcome, versus the configuration of SAP or any other products out there.
Yeah. And I guess that would probably apply to any of that style of system, so an ERP,
or a CRM,
anything like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Excuse me. Interesting question. All this seems to be dependent upon having our data very effectively managed. If our data isn't effectively managed, we can probably assume who wrote this, it probably isn't. Can we still take advantage of all these ideas?
Well, of course you can. I think the idea is that you've got to start small, think big, but ultimately you have to have data governance, trust, data quality throughout your data layers. So I still see the governance and the quality and the management aspect running in parallel, but that doesn't mean to say that you can't start thinking about those data operations and how the two lens of the full of this data space coming together.
Okay. So it sounds, I think, from the last couple of questions, if you're a large organisation that has these really big centralised systems, they can still take advantage of this thinking. If you're a small organisation that maybe hasn't got everything sorted yet, you can still take advantage. So it feels like it applies to everybody.
Yes, it does.
Fantastic. Well, I tell you what, I think we should probably stop on that approach, because that's, I think, a fairly fundamental point. So just to let you know, thank you for your time today. Hopefully you found that useful. Mel and I are going to be visiting London and Glasgow on the 1st and 2nd of October, where we're going to be hosting a roundtable in each location, obviously. The idea is just kind of talk about some of these ideas a bit more, give you a bit more behind the thinking that kind of went into this, some examples of what we're seeing organisations do, maybe some good practice and maybe some not good practice. So please feel free to come and join us on either of those locations. We'll be pleased to welcome you. With that, thanks very much for your time, Mel. Thank you for your time again this morning.
Thank you, Andy.
No problem. And thanks very much, and we'll hopefully see you all again very soon. Thanks for now.